ask that question. Being good is a hard thing to do, very hard. It requires us to do things we'd rather not do, like obeying our conscience. It's no fun, so why bother?
So what was the last sentence in the question?
I would ask, why bother being good? It's hard.
Oh.
What's the point?
Yes, well, I think that two things could be said about that. First, you're morally obligated to do it. You should do it because this is the right thing to do, despite the difficulties. But then if that doesn't move you, I would appeal to moral accountability. You will be held morally accountable for what you do, and that ought to give you a very good reason for adopting a moral point of view.
Hi, Dr. Craig. Thanks very much for speaking with us tonight. My question doesn't necessarily have to do with doing good, but I'm just going to throw it out there to you anyways.
All right.
Okay? Hopefully that's okay with everybody else. So I live with two atheists. One was actually going into ministry for a while. They're both, one's in his 50s, one's in his 70s. And we have a lot of discussions on beliefs and our belief systems and their non-belief systems. And the question that they always pose to me about my faith in Christianity is, if there were so many stories before that lined up with the same story of Jesus, as in a virgin birth and dying and coming back to life, that were supposedly told before, why do I believe that the one of Jesus is the true story?
Okay. There are two levels on which one can respond to that question. The first one is that, in fact, there are not these supposed parallels or previous such stories. This was explored by scholars in comparative religion in the late 19th, early 20th century. Scholars in comparative religion ransacked the literature of ancient mythology looking for parallels to Christian beliefs. And some even suggested that Christian beliefs might be due to the influence of these pagan myths. This movement, however, soon collapsed within scholarship, principally for two reasons. First of all, as I say, it turned out that the parallels were spurious. For example, take the supposed parallels to a virgin birth. When you look at these pagan mythological stories, what they actually are stories of a god coming down from heaven, assuming human form or animal form, and having sexual intercourse with human females. And so it's the exact opposite of a virgin birth. It's not a virginal conception at all. It's a story of gods copulating with women. In fact, the virgin birth story in the Gospels is unparalleled in either pagan mythology or Jewish literature prior to the time of Jesus. Similarly, with regard to so-called dying and rising deities, it's generally agreed among scholars in comparative religions today that there are no myths of dying and rising deities in the ancient world. Mythological figures like Osiris don't come back to life. He just lives on in the underworld and continues to reign in the realm of the dead. So this claim that early Christian beliefs should be understood due to the influence of or against the backdrop of pagan mythology is a view that is 100 years out of date under scholars. It has been abandoned since the beginning of the early years of the 20th century. And the fact that this is still propagated on the internet and in certain infidel websites is simply testimony to the enormous gap that exists between scholarly work on these subjects and popular culture. In fact, scholars have come to realize that the proper context for understanding the Gospels and Jesus of Nazareth is not pagan mythology, but first century Palestinian Judaism. Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew, and all the disciples were Jews. And it is against the backdrop of first century Palestinian Judaism that Jesus and the Gospels are to be properly understood. So that this earlier idea of interpreting them against the backdrop of pagan mythology has just been completely abandoned among historical scholars today. It was realized that this was the wrong interpretive context for understanding Jesus of Nazareth. That would be the first reason. The second reason is that when you do investigate the gospel with a view toward establishing their historical credibility, then it turns out that they are very good sources for the life of Jesus, historically. So that they're not myths. These are not fairy tales or legends. These are of the genre of ancient biography, like the lives of famous Greeks and Romans, such as Plutarch wrote. And ancient biographies have a historical interest. So what they amount to are 4 biographies of this man, Jesus of Nazareth, as well as then the other materials in the New Testament. So the contemporary historical Jesus scholars treat the Gospels and the New Testament documents seriously as important sources for the life of Jesus, and have largely confirmed the outline of the portrait of Jesus painted in the Gospels. So it's just incorrect to equate these with myths. They're not. They're biography. They're history.
My question assumes that this God reveals or conveys his moral laws through some natural means in the universe. Is this conveyance or revelation, is it static or is it dynamic based on the individual level of receptibility?
Well, as a Christian theist, I would say it is dynamic in that certain of the laws that God, for example, commanded ancient Israel to observe are no longer valid today. So I think that the laws that were appropriate for Israel at that time in its infancy didn't necessarily express the full moral will of God, but in some cases represented condescensions to the situation in which Israel existed and were satisfactory, but didn't express his full will. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, you see, for example, Jesus sharpening the law and the ethic of the Old Testament and seeing its inner point and reinforcing that in contrast to the simple external legalistic interpretation of that. So I do think it can be dynamic, but underlying that, there will be certain timeless ethical principles, like the intrinsic value of human beings, and that we should treat others as ends in themselves rather than as means to ends. But how that comes to expression in various societies and times may vary.